Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Oh, okay, I thought I was talking to the lights and they didn't respond. Good afternoon, friends of the Hymn Society. Good afternoon, my name is Lisa Weaver and I serve on the executive committee as a member at large for the Hymn Society. And also, we'd like to welcome all of our virtual attendees. We want to say and extend a hearty welcome to you as well. I want to introduce, it is my task, joy, and assignment to introduce our speaker. Mikako Ehara has a BA from University Music Department, Tokyo Gakugei, forgive any mispronunciations, and she also has served in Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary in church music. She's in choir of the Cathedral of St. John the Divine in New York, and also a member of New York Choral Society. She presently serves as a minister of church music in a Baptist church in Japan. Her full biography is available online under the panelists, so we invite and encourage you to look at that. So, without further ado, I would like to welcome Mikako Ehara, and her topic is the Spirit of Awakening in Japan Baptist Hymns and Worship. Join me in welcoming her.
Hi, everyone. I'm so happy to be here with you all at this wonderful conference. My name is Mikako Ehara, and I'm with the delegation from Japan this year. I attended this conference twice online, and now I'm so happy to be here with you today. I have already enjoyed meeting and listening to so many people. It is really a joy to be able to learn and share the joy of music and hymns here with you all. Today, I would like to share with you how the JBC, the Japan Baptist Convention, has changed and grown in its approach to hymn compilation. Japan has a lot of catching up to do when it comes to critical approaches to hymns and hymnal compilation. But I think the issues we have experienced in Japan will resonate with your own experience in composing or compiling hymns or in your own ministries. Let me tell you briefly where we in the Japan Baptist Convention music field are today. We are in a state of wondering. It's time to revise our hymnal. In these past few years, our awareness of a host of issues has grown and changed. And now, it seems like we are even more unsure of how to proceed than we believed before. Where do we start? How do we go about it? What should be our process? First, let me tell you briefly about my background and how I came to be here with you today, participating in this conference. I grew up in what in Japan is called a Christian home. Our family attended Oi Baptist Church in Tokyo. And my parents were both very active in the church. My brother and I, of course, attended Sunday worship, Sunday school, revival meetings, and children and youth camp. I also played piano and sang in the choir. I received the Master of Music degree from Southwestern Theological Seminary, then moved to New York for 2 years. Attended and sang in the choir at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine, and was blessed to be able to learn so much there. Now, I'm music director at Sagami Chuo Christchurch in Kanagawa Prefecture, near Tokyo, the head of the church music department at the Japan Baptist Convention. After returning to Japan, one of the leaders in music in the JBC, Reni Otani, who was originally a missionary from the Southern Baptist Convention, invited me to join a group that had just been formed to compile a new hymnal that became the 2003 New Life Hymnal. That was my first experience compiling a hymnal. I didn't have any knowledge either of how to go about compiling a hymnal. Just a year after the publication of New Life Hymnal 2003 is when I became the director of the church music department for the JBC. I'm sure many of you have been involved in hymnal compilation before. And I would really love to hear about your own experience. In my experience with the JBC's 2003 New Life Hymnal, I saw firsthand how much work goes into making a hymnal, especially in the later editing process. The 2003 New Life Hymnal has 682 hymns, a pretty big hymnal, especially when you consider that we had to choose from about a couple thousand hymns. It was a lot of work, but the hymn compilation process never seemed that complicated. We weren't that sensitive at the time to the actual contents of the hymns and why we sing these hymns. Only after the publication of the hymnal in 2003 did we begin to think about and discuss issues like the mission of music in the church, discriminatory language, inclusiveness, militaristic language, and themes in hymns, sacrifice theory, and the objectification of, quote, others. Since the publication of the New Life Hymnal in 2003, a host of issues has emerged. And now, it seems like compiling the next generation hymnal will be even more complicated. And I wonder how we should even get started. How do we arrive at our current state of wondering? How do we undertake such a big task of compiling the 2003 hymnal with 682 hymns without any great critical awareness of the compilation process and the contents of the hymns themselves? I think we can see why when we look at how Protestant hymnals were compiled in Japan up until this time. Briefly first, I think it would be a good idea to provide some context. There are about 125 million people in Japan now, but the population has been decreasing every year, now for several years. And there are only about 1 million Christians in Japan, or about only 0.83% of the total population. The present Japan Baptist Convention, JBC, was founded right after World War II in 1947. But the JBC usually marks its beginnings in 1889, when the first U.S. Southern Baptist missionaries arrived in Japan. Then, in 1903, the various U.S. Southern Baptist-related Japanese churches formed the Western Japan Alliance in 1940. The Japanese government enacted the Religious Organizations Law to control religion in the wartime period. Then, in 1941, the government forced 33 various Protestant denominations to form one religious organization called the United Church of Christ in Japan, UCCJ. So the government could monitor and control the Protestant churches in Japan. Soon after the war, however, the Western Japan Baptist Alliance left the UCCJ and formed the Japan Baptist Convention in 1947. At its peak, there were 333 churches in the JBC. The number of Sunday worshipers in the JBC plateaued from 1994 to 2012 at a little over 14,000 participants, and as of 2020 has fallen to around 9,600. There are presently 316 active churches. The JBC has 3 seminaries and has sent missionaries to Brazil, Indonesia, Thailand, Singapore, and Cambodia, and has supported the work of Kazuyuki Sasaki at PIAS, the Protestant Institute of Arts and Social Sciences, in Rwanda. Churches voluntarily contribute the support of the JBC, but the JBC has no ecclesiastical control over local churches or regional Baptist groups. Despite the U.S. Southern Baptist role in the founding and support of Japan Baptists, when it comes to doctrine, the JBC is very different from the U.S. Southern Baptist Convention. For example, concerning women pastors, the Japan Baptist Convention, quote, does not exclude women pastors, but rather welcomes them. There are other issues, such as biblical interpretation, that individual members of the JBC might not see eye to eye on with the U.S. Southern Baptist Convention. But that is really a whole topic in itself. Despite these differences large and small. However, the Japan Baptist Convention still feels a great appreciation for the generous support of the U.S. Southern Baptists over many, many years. Now, back to hymn compilation. The story starts in Japan with what is called the Hymnal of 1903. This was the first interdenominational Protestant hymnal in Japan. It was compiled by 5 Protestant denominations, including the Japan Baptists, and comprised mostly 18th and 19th century Anglo-American hymns. Foremost in the minds of the compilers of the 1903 hymnal was consolidating the efforts of the various Protestant denominations to make evangelism more efficient. This 1903 hymnal was so popular in Japan that it became the standard hymnal in Japan and really created in the minds of Japanese people the image of what Protestant and Christian music was all about. Because it included a large number of gospel hymns which were comforting and catchy. Gospel songs have become the favorites of many people in Japan. I can give you one example from Japanese popular culture that will show you just how influential this 1903 hymnal was. This song, I'm sure you can guess the tune. I'll sing it in Japanese for you. Raise your hand if you'd like when you figure it out. I'm sure you'll guess it right away. I don't need to sing it. Okay. So what's the song title? Yes, right. So what a friend we have in Jesus. As I mentioned earlier, Christians are less than 1% of the Japanese population. But so-called Christian weddings held in Christian chapels are very popular in Japan. And for some reason, this hymn, What a Friend We Have in Jesus, is always sung at these wedding ceremonies. The 1903 hymnal was so good at introducing Western hymns like What a Friend We Have in Jesus that this song, for example, is used whenever someone wants to make something like a wedding appear, quote, Christian. Although the connection between this song and a wedding is not as strong, the hymn has nonetheless been the most widely sung hymn in these, quote, Christian weddings. I'm not as sure about its place in the wedding ceremony, but it is a testament to how influential the 1903 hymnal has been. The next major interdenominational Protestant hymnal in Japan after the hymnal of 1903 was what was titled the Hymnal of 1931, not an entirely original title. It was a response to the large number of 18th and 19th century Anglo-American hymns in the 1903 hymnal. It was also a reaction to the gospel songs included in the 1903 hymnal. The Scholarly Church Music Association in Japan promoted the creation revision of the new hymnal, and therefore the result was more hymnologically academic than the 1903 hymnal. It included ancient, Middle-aged Latin, Greek hymns, German choral, psalmody, social gospel, and ecumenical hymns. Despite the overwhelmingly large number of European and American hymns, 11% of the hymns, the 1931 hymnal, were original Japanese hymns, an increase over the 1903 hymnal. One of the sticking points with the 1931 hymnal, however, which we will see come up later, was the placing the gospel songs in a new so-called miscellaneous section in the back of the hymnal. Foremost in the minds of the compilers of the 1931 hymnal was re-establishing Protestant hymns and hymnals as the leading edge of highbrow Western music in Japan. Therefore, the focus on more hymnologically academic and ancient and middle-aged hymns and some choir pieces, which were included. Next was the hymnal of 1954, the United Church of Christ in Japan, or UCCJ. The UCCJ, you may recall, was the multi-denominational Protestant organization the Japanese wartime government created in 1941. Government supervision ended at the end of the war. The UCCJ re-established itself free of government control. And as I mentioned earlier, the Japan Baptists left their organization right after the war in 1947. So, the hymnal of 1954 was compiled without JBC input. And along with the formation of the Japanese government of the multi-denominational UCCJ, all of the hymns which were contributed to the 1931 hymnal by the various denominations became the property of the UCCJ. As a result, Japanese Baptists lost their claim to the hymns in the UCCJ hymnal. The 1954 hymnal compilers were responding to several issues. Since the hymnal of 1931, Japan had lost a 15-year war in Manchuria, an 8-year war with China, and an almost 4-year war with the Western allies. The Japanese national anthem, which calls for the emperor's eternal reign, and other nationalistic hymns which were in the 1931 hymnal, were cut. And nationalistic language such as the fatherland and archaic expressions were either completely cut or modified. And 1954 compilers were responding to the difficulty of singing the 1931 hymnal. 1931 hymns in worship. The compilers felt that the musical notation and the high pitch of the 1931 hymnal was too difficult for typical congregational singing. The 1954 hymnal was aimed at congregational worship. It included pure evangelical and gospel songs. It was lower pitch, easier to sing. The musical notation was easier for congregations to follow. At the same time, it was more ecumenical than the 1931 hymnal and included Danish, German, and Chinese hymns. Finally, the Japan Baptist Convention publishes its own hymnals in a series of 4 small volumes, and then a larger centennial version, and then finally in the 2003 hymnal we now use. The first volumes were responses to, according to some Japanese Baptists, quote, a lack of vital spirit and joy of new life, unquote, in the 1954 hymnal, and to the Japan-wide evangelical New Life movement begun in 1963. They were for use in revival meetings and contained mostly gospel songs. These volumes were small, pocket size, to be easily used at revival meetings. Other than the focus on revival meetings, however, there was no guiding, organizing principles as to what to include or how to arrange the hymns. If we take a look at the table of contents, for example, we can see that the hymns are placed in sections titled New Life, Praise, God's Love, rather than in any particular order of worship. Between the publication of the New Life Hymnal, Volume 2 of 1963 and Volume 3 of 1982, something quite dramatic occurred in the JBC. In 1976, the JBC announced plans to become financially independent of the U.S. Southern Baptist Convention Foreign Mission Board and fund 100% of its operating costs and evangelical activities entirely on its own within 5 years. Just how big was the U.S. Southern Baptist Convention Foreign Mission Board funding of the JBC? I'd like to give you some interesting numbers. Between 1950 and 1967, the U.S. Southern Baptist Convention funded on average 94.8% of the JBC's annual operating costs. In 1967, the amount was almost 100%. And some local Japanese church land purchase and building construction costs were also funded by the U.S. SBC. You would think that with this amount of funding, the U.S. Southern Baptist Convention would have had more control over JBC doctrine and its position on social issues. However, the Japan Baptist Convention has always been quite independent when it comes to social issues, and I think it would be hard to see any similarities today between the U.S. Southern Baptist Convention and the Japan Baptist Convention on almost any social issue, such as women pastors and gender roles in marriage. For example, during the period between the publications of the New Life Hymnal, volumes 2 and 3, attitudes toward the Vietnam War reveal a large gap between the U.S. Southern Baptist Convention and the JBC. Shigeyoshi Suzuki, whom I just mentioned, wrote that, quote, U.S. Southern Baptist missionaries at Japanese churches taught conservative doctrine without application to the social situation. For example, racial discrimination or the war in Vietnam, unquote. One example, in 1965, when the JBC issued a declaration against the U.S. war in Vietnam, Japanese Baptist churchgoers voted 100% in favor of the declaration, while the U.S. Southern Baptist missionaries voted 100% against it. In the 1960s and 70s and now, the JBC has been quite independently minded. You might think that this independence and concern for social issues in the JBC has had some great effect on the social issue content of Japanese hymns around this time. But that is not the case. When it comes to the contents of the music in the Japan Baptist Convention, it seems we are yet to find our own voice. There are progressive thinkers in the JBC, seminaries, churches, who are working on many critical issues. But there is still a gap between the social concerns and progressive thinking of these leaders on the one hand, and the relatively unchanging contents of the hymnals on the other hand. The New Life Hymnal, volumes 3 of 1982 and 4 of 1984, were responses to the JBC banner theme from 1970, Independence and Cooperation. Also, they were in response to there being only one original Japanese hymn in the New Life Hymnals 1 and 2. In contrast, 2/3 of the hymns in volumes 3 and 4 were by Japanese Baptist Church members. Moving quickly along, the New Life Hymnals 3 and 4 were followed by what is called the Centennial version of 1989, marking the centennial of the first arrival of U.S. Southern Baptist missionaries to Japan. It was a response to the New Life Hymnal series, between primarily for evangelism. The easily carried slim volumes of the New Life Hymnals 1 through 4 were not sufficient for week-to-week Sunday congregational worship. This centennial version comprised 261 hymns and was what might be called the JBC's first full-length non-booklet type hymnal. However, the JBC was unable to get permissions to use many hymns from the UCCJ hymnal, and as a result, included only 24 worship service songs. And now, we come to our present hymnal, the New Life Hymnal of 2003. It was a response to the limited number of worship hymns in the centennial version. It was also a response to a more global perspective. The JBC had begun sending missionaries abroad from 1963, and many hymns from these countries were included in the 2003 hymnal. In addition, the New Life Hymnal 2003 included many hymns from the hymnal World Baptist Praise 2000 from the Baptist World Alliance 2000 meeting. The focus of the 2003 hymnal compilers was increasing the number of hymns to 682 hymns from the 261 in the centennial version, including more worship hymns, including more Japanese Baptist original hymns to 105 out of the 682 hymns, and diversifying the hymnal to include global hymns from Indonesia, Thailand, Korea, China, and France. It includes hymns from 20 different languages. Before we look at the critical issues that we have become aware of recently, how do we assess the 100 years from the interdenominational 1903 hymnal and the Japan Baptist Convention's own hymnal, the 2003 New Life Hymnal? With the interdenominational 1903 hymnal, we see a true spirit and passion for overcoming the tendency toward denominational fiefdoms and for spreading the spirit of Christianity in Japan in the early 20th century. With the 1931 hymnal, the compilers can be credited with making the hymnal more ecumenical. And we see a striving for standards. I mentioned earlier that this hymnal was, quote, more hymnologically academic than the 1903 hymnal and could appeal to those looking for something more musically sophisticated. Then, with the 1954 hymnal, we see a focus on congregational worship. And with the JBC's own New Life Hymnal series, we see a focus on evangelism and on valuing the gospel song tradition. It makes me think how wonderful it would be to take the best from each of these hymnals in a hymn legacy and add to it and create something beautifully diverse and holistic, both new and traditional, and with a new critical awareness. Which brings me to the final section of my presentation today. What is our current state of critical awareness? And how does our current state of awareness inform and direct our hymn compilation process now and in the future? We start, as we all do, I think, with what we have at hand at the moment, which is, with us in the JBC, our current hymnal, the 2003 New Life Hymnal. The 2003 New Life Hymnal is certainly a great achievement. It comprises a robust 682 hymns. It includes hymns from across centuries and continents. It has the beloved standards. It has all the features you would expect from a modern hymnal: various indexes, clean and easy to read text, and the only accompaniment CD-ROM in Japan. It has all the signs of a healthy hymnal. It seems to be everything that a hymnal should be. However, for all of its appearance as a robust hymnal, I'm wondering, what are we not seeing? What are we missing? Discerning what is not there, I think, is a much more difficult task than knowing what is there. In her book, Norse Garden, the American author Sarah Stein tells the story of her own evolving and growing critical awareness. She and her partner buy land that had been depleted from more than a century of over-farming. By the time they bought the land, however, it had not been farmed for some years and was beginning to regain its lush green naturalness. But all was not what it seemed. Sarah Stein writes, "Our land seemed to exemplify recovery, but only, quote, on superficial examination. As she looked more closely at the land, what seemed healthy, natural at first, slowly began to seem less and less so." She writes, "As I gradually learned recovery, we might say robustness was normal only in its general outline. The details were pathological." Slowly, Sarah Stein's way of seeing changes. She discovers that the exuberant greenery in the landscape was a tangle of invasive and harmful species. She begins to study old almanacs and discovers what kinds of plants had once, long ago, thrived on the land. Of her discovering in the almanacs this wonderful diversity of lost species, she wrote, "I wandered aimlessly through the pages of a world strangely new." And she realized that what was not there, what was missing from the landscape, all the species that had disappeared, that she had never seen or even heard of before, for example, was an even more critical sign of the land's depletion than what she could see before her. She wrote, "A twist of mind was needed to realize that what was not strike the eye is an even more critical indication of disease." In the JBC's journey of compiling the 2003 New Life Hymnal and afterward, I have come to realize that Sarah Stein must have realized through her experience We don't have all the answers yet. We don't have perfect vision yet. But we are beginning to see what has been missing in our hymn compilation journey. Through our music in worship workshops, we realized that we had compiled the 2003 hymnal without a critical study or knowledge of worship. All of the JBC hymnals that we grew up using were aimed at revival meetings, not week-to-week Sunday worship. And through the workshops, we began questioning things that we had never thought of before. Or even if we had thought of these issues, we might have been too afraid to raise them. Like, are hymns sung to God? If so, what is the image of God in the minds of worshipers? If we sing to the Father, to whom do we imagine we are singing? When we sing of sinners, do first-time non-Christian visitors to the worship service think that we are singing about them? These issues were not addressed, even thought of in the 2003 hymnal compilation process. Our next step in this process of questioning and growing awareness was our discussions in the Hymn Review Committee that we started in 2008. We set out to examine each of the 682 hymns in the 2003 hymnal. This examination of the hymns was proposed soon after the publication of the 2003 hymnal. You are thinking, didn't they get the process backwards? Shouldn't you examine the contents of the hymns before putting them in the hymnal? Yes, of course. But the hymn compilation was so rushed that we really couldn't or didn't take the time to thoroughly examine and discuss each hymn. Yet, soon after the publication of the hymnal in 2003, someone proposed that we begin educating ourselves to look critically at hymns and the hymn compilation process. So, our hymn review committee began identifying and examining a whole range of issues we were not that sensitive to before, such as discriminatory language in Japanese hymns, inclusiveness, the language of the Japanese imperial system in hymns, archaic language in hymns, and militaristic tones and language in hymns like enemy, fight, war, soldier, banner, for, etc. It has taken us a while, but we have begun to be more aware of these issues. There are three critical issues that we have become more awakened to that I would like to tell you about in more detail. First, we've begun to discuss what hymns are actually appropriate for various participants in the worship service. What do I mean by that? Many Japanese hymns, for example, use the word kegare, meaning stained or unclean. For example, hymn number 50 in the JBC's 2003 hymnal is a Japanese language version of hymn 328, Wonderful Grace of Jesus, from the 1991 U.S. Southern Baptist hymnal. The lines at issue here in the original English version are broader than the scope of my transgressions, greater far than all my sin and shame. Almighty tide the Lord that demons. I can sing that high. That's it. So you know the song, right? These lines have been translated into Japanese in the JBC hymnal as stained upon a stained self. And here, the word stained is expressed through the Japanese word kegare. This same word, kegare, stained, has been used historically to describe people of the lowest caste in Japanese society, called the burakumin. These people have traditionally been relegated to occupations considered unclean, such as slaughterhouse workers, butchers, leather workers, and undertakers. In 1871, the Japanese government prohibited discrimination based on caste, but the descendants of the burakumin caste are still somewhat discriminated against. Imagine someone from this caste who has been discriminated against their whole life, coming to the worship service seeking love and acceptance, only to hear this word, kegare, in the congregational singing. It wasn't until 2016 when the Hymn Review Committee sent out questionnaires to various social issue committees in the Japan Baptist Convention that we received feedback that using this word, kegare, was a serious issue. The tune for this song, the same tune in the original English version and the Japanese version, is really jaunty and bouncy, and almost completely obscures these problematic lyrics. And when you consider that someone from the burakumin caste could really have a negative reaction to the lyrics as they are in the Japanese version, the gap between the lyrics and the tune and the Christian message of acceptance becomes a serious issue. I'm rather ashamed to say that we had never thought of this term, kegare, as problematic before 2016. Secondly, we've also begun to question sacrifice theory, the virtue of sacrificing one's life in regards to the contents of worship hymns. For example, number 639 in the JBC New Life Hymnal is a Japanese language version of Make Me a Channel of Blessing. Number 564 in the U.S. Southern Baptist Hymnal of 1991. In the original English version, we find the line, make me a channel of blessing, I pray. Make me a channel of blessing, I pray. My life possessing, my service blessing. Make me a channel of blessing today. the words, "my life possessing," "my service blessing," were translated into Japanese, however, to mean, "give up your life to the Lord." This might not sound so problematic, but it is in Japan, with its deep history and culture of sacrifice. We have a Yasukuni Shrine Issues Committee in the JBC. The Yasukuni Shrine in Tokyo is a Shinto shrine commemorating the war dead, including many convicted war criminals. When a hymn review committee asked the various issues committees in the JBC for their opinions regarding the 2003 hymnal, the Yasukuni Shrine Issues Committee responded that the Yasukuni Shrine uses almost the exact same expression as found in John 15:13. Everyone is familiar with John 15:13. Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. The Yasukuni Shrine Issues Committee pointed out that the motto for the association that supports the Yasukuni Shrine, the so-called Association to Revere Fallen Heroes, is, quote, "to revere our heroes who have sacrificed their lives for our country." The association is a popular movement to instill the proper attitude from the nation and from the people to our fallen heroes, unquote. From the late 1880s and up until the end of World War II, Japan's militarized society and culture abounded with stories of self-sacrifice. However, nowadays, 75 years since the end of the war, you would be hard-pressed to find many Japanese people praising self-sacrifice in war or identifying with the Yasukuni Shrine. But unhealthy attitudes of self-sacrifice still live on among Japanese salarymen, company employees, and women in society. But compared to 75 years ago, attitudes in Japan are changing. For example, people are slowly beginning to question the long hours, the long commutes, little time off, and weekend work that has overworked these salarymen and kept them from their families. And women nowadays do not automatically abandon their careers when they marry. And sex-based wage discrimination in Japan is finally becoming an issue that people talk about. The JBC Sexual Discrimination Issues Committee pointed out to us that sacrifice theory can contribute to the oppression of the weak in society. The question then for us is, how can our hymns and congregational singing be of ministry to, for example, salarymen or women in society? Third, and finally, we have begun to recognize and look critically at the objectification of the other in hymns, especially toward, quote, sinners, the weak, the perishing, the sick of heart. In the Japanese translation, this other is usually imagined as people out in the world, outside the church, unchurched people. And the sense is of a church looking down on non-churched people from some other lofty position. For example, we can look at hymn number 383 in the 2000 hymnal, originally from hymn 559, Rescue the Perishing. In the Southern Baptist hymnal, we see the phrase, tell them of Jesus the mighty to save. Tell them of Jesus the mighty to save, rescue the perishing, care for the dying. You know the rest. This is translated in the Japanese hymnal to mean, tell the people of the world of our Lord Jesus, save sinners, which sounds an awfully lot like it is directed to people outside the church. This hymn has, in the past, been a popular hymn in the JBC for both revival meetings and regular Sunday worship services. I remember singing it often as a child, but I personally wouldn't choose this song for public worship. There are some churches in the JBC still singing this hymn on Sundays, but I care to think that they sing it without questioning the lyrics and sing it instead out of nostalgia, or maybe they just like the tune. So, what have we at the Japan Baptist Convention learned so far about hymn compilation? What is the work at hand? What should we be doing? 1. We must bridge the gap between Japan Baptist theologians, pastors, leaders, church members, and hymn compilers. One thing we have learned is that there is a lack of interconnection between Japanese Baptist theologians, pastors, and church music leaders, because many theologians and pastors think music is music's territory, and they should leave music up to the music leaders. Kind of a humorous example, but I remember I inviting all these pastors and music leaders to a workshop one time. And one pastor drove to the workshop with his church music leaders and accompanists. I was so happy the pastor had come, but when I looked around later, he was gone. He thought his job that day was just a driver. I contrast this with the hymn explosion movement, which was led by theologians and pastors, and now I'm trying to find ways to involve theologians and pastors in church music. I have found that the theologians and pastors participate more actively in discussions about music when we ask these committees to consider specific issues such as problematic language, kegare, and sexual discrimination. JBC theologians have a lot to offer, but the structures have not been there to facilitate a cross-sharing of ideas and information between the quote, theology people and quote, music people. And I must be fair, music leaders in the JBC must study and apply theology. 2, we must bring critical missiology and congregational singing closer together. I know all of you are quite familiar with the hymn explosion in the 1960s and 70s with its concern with aligning the mission, message, and music of the church. It's now going on 50-something years or so since the hymn explosion, and I am kind of embarrassed to say that we in the JBC have yet to seriously consider how these issues of mission, message, and music relate. Why have we not considered the mission and the hymns in relation to each other? What do we do with gospel songs, for example? Are they still appropriate? Are they still relevant in contemporary Japan Baptist worship? Is singing about sinners and saving sinners doing the most important work of the church? We should begin to question whether revival meeting style hymns focused on sin, altar calls, confession, salvation, and heaven are appropriate in today's Japanese worship services. 3, we must focus on process and criteria, especially in the early stages of compilation. The first steps in compilation should concern how the compilation process will proceed. In the 2003 New Life Hymnal compilation process, there were no guidelines, for example, for considering which hymns to include. Selection was simply based on what committee members recommended based on their own preferences. What do we do when lyrics are no longer deemed appropriate? Can we continue to sing these lyrics? Do we cancel these lyrics? The process and criteria need to be carefully thought out in the earliest stages. Otherwise, technical issues can easily crowd out more critical discussion as deadlines loom and people get busy and down to work. 4, we must intensify our focus on social and relational issues. In the compilation process for the 2003 New Life Hymnal, concerns centered mostly around how many hymns to include in the hymnal, what global hymns to include, and where to include praise songs. What was missing in the 2003 compilation processes was any discussion of larger social and relational issues. The issues were there. Japan Baptist pastors and seminary teachers have been very outspoken on social issues, but for some reason, we in the music field in the JBC either didn't see these certainly compelling issues, or we did see them and simply neglected them. Of course, you might argue that no denomination on any continent was filling their hymnals to the brim with social issue hymns. But still, we could have and should have done more. But we didn't. And why? We must seek out and create lyrics that do no harm and are welcoming and inclusive. Fifth, any future hymnal must be suited to a contemporary ethos. The New Life Hymnal series was suited to the Japanese post-war growth ethos. But future hymnals must reflect new issues and challenges and point to ways forward. Before the New Life Hymnal 2003, the JBC banner, 500 churches, 50,000 members goal, since 2011 has shifted to doing the work of reconciliation. Future hymnals will need to reflect new issues and challenges and point to ways forward. I'm glad to say that a few bright lights have already begun to appear in the night sky that have inspired us in the JBC to really be more creative. One is the hymn of reconciliation. Christ help us to realize in the UCCJ hymnal, and the other is a collection of hymns on the plight of Okinawa and the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki by the Japan Anglican Church, Nippon Seiko Kai. Christ help us to realize is included in the collection of hymns that we prepared and handed out for this conference. You have one, right? And you can get a copy. You can get the copy if you don't have one. Okay. The hymn is a confession of sin and a petition for forgiveness from Japan to the Asian countries that suffered at the hands of the Japanese military during World War II. And the hymn is also an appeal to living in peace and harmony in Christ's work of love. So, please open 25, song number 25. Let us sing the song together. Just first verse. Christ help us to realize, since we have committed unknowingly, give us the strength we need to let our losses follow These are the kinds of songs I hope the Japan Baptist Convention will be creating and including in a new hymnal. I knew of these songs of reconciliation and repentance through participating in the Interdenominational Hymn Society in Japan. Another bright light in the night sky. The Hymn Society was formed in 2001. Is that rain? And has really opened up the sharing of ideas and knowledge that had previously been tucked away in the corners of the various denominations. We at the JBC, and personally, have been able to learn a great deal through the interdenominational study and fellowship in the Hymn Society. And, of course, our being able to participate here with you in the 2022 annual conference. This week has been a great blessing and has helped empower us to make change back home. And finally, 6. So far, we've looked at issues of content and process. But there is one more issue that we will definitely impact what kind of hymnal we might make in the future, or whether we'll even be able to make a new hymnal, and that is the decreasing church population. Can we devote several years, maybe even 10 years or so, to making a new printed 682 hymnal? Do we have the people? Do we have the money? With many churches facing economic issues, would there be enough churches purchasing the hymnal to make it economically viable? With many churches now lacking even a pianist or organist, what meaning does the hymnal have? Should we bypass a printed hymnal and just publish the hymns digitally online? If so, do smaller churches have members who can retrieve the digitalized hymns for printing at the church or for use as PowerPoint slides? These are all critical issues, aside from content, that we will have to address and figure out. I do think we should adopt a more swift-footed approach to compilation. A good strategy might be to adopt a more swift-footed approach. Regularly publish hymnals of 20 to 30 hymns centered around a common theme, concern, or issue, for example. New, smaller, and more frequently published hymnals could better keep up with and respond to changing societal issues and evolving critical awareness. In conclusion, imagine a church that doesn't just look robust and healthy on the surface, but is truly inclusive and loving and honest and just. And imagine the hymns that are still to be written and sung that will help us make this vision a reality. It really makes the heart filled with excitement. It has taken this first 100 years of hymn making for us in the church music field in the JBC to finally become awakened. But I am looking forward to the challenges and the possibilities of the next 100 years. One new issues will emerge. We can imagine trials and tribulations to come. Climate change that leads to scarce resources, that leads to hunger, that then leads to demagoguery, nationalism, racism, that leads to the hoarding of resources and wealth, to the closing of our national borders to the hungry and endangered. That could lead to the closing of our church doors and hearts to the other, and to violence and war. It is easy to imagine challenging times ahead. But the pressing question that calls on us now is, how will we as music leaders in the church respond? Through our songs, we can actively and creatively confront these emerging issues with an open heart, an open mind, open arms, and an open church. With growing awareness, we continually see issues that we have never seen before. We find ourselves like Sarah Stein in a land strangely new. Sarah Stein gives us a vision of the process of becoming awakened. But one of the really wonderful things about her book is the conclusion. She doesn't just present us with the issues of which there are many. She provides concrete and understandable methods and solutions to, as she says, restore the ecology of our own backyards. She writes, "Our task is nothing less than to create a new landscape. That is why I believe we are gathered here today, just 1/5 into this new century, to share hope, critical visions, strategies, and methods that will help us restore this earth and this big family we call humanity." I look forward to sharing and learning with you all at this conference. Thank you.